Now, northeast Nigeria's conflict with Islamist insurgencies has killed nearly 350,000 people as of the end of 2020, the United Nations Development Programme said on Thursday. The toll given by the UN agency is in a new study on the war and its impact on livelihoods says it's 10 times higher than previous estimates of about 35,000 based on only those killed in fighting in Nigeria since the conflict started 12 years ago. Nigeria's war with the Islamist insurgencies, Boko Haram, and Islamic State's West Africa province has spawned one of the world's worst humanitarian crises, with millions of people dependent on aid. The conflict shows little sign of ending. Children younger than 5 account for more than 9 out of 10 of those killed, with 170 dying every day, the UNDP said. The agency notes that if the conflict continues to 2030, more than 1.1 million people may die. Joining us now is AISHA OYEBODE, co-founder of Bring Back Our Girls, BBOG. Good to have you, AISHA, to shed some light on this very troubling report.
Hello, good afternoon. Nice to be here.
Yeah, great. Well, I wish I had something cheerful to talk about, but I just want to ask you before we delve into the findings, does it bother you at all that these findings are coming from an external body and not our own people on the ground? Does it matter that we ourselves gather this kind of data on the happenings in the Northeast?
Yes, it's important. And, it's interesting because almost 3 years ago, we'd been sounding alarm bells as to the humanitarian crisis, because we could see there was widespread displacements, breach of humanitarian and human rights laws, protection risks. There were so many issues. But the greatest one that we had been pointing out for quite a while was the critical food shortages. As of today, I think based on the statistics, we're seeing about 4.4 million people facing a critical food shortage, of which 775,000 of them are at extreme risk. So do we have our data? Yes, we do. And I think the challenge has always been that we sound the alarm bells much earlier. And unfortunately, sometimes it takes some of these international NGOs to pretty much repeat what we've been saying for quite a while for notice to be taken. But the important thing is that is notice being taken, and that's what is important to us at this time. We have a decade of conflict. This Boko Haram insurgency has been going on for over 10 years now. There are lots of needs that are unmet. We have the challenge part of it also is that the security situation is such that only those that are in what we call garrison towns like Maiduguri and so on, where the military is stationed, are able to get help. People are begging. There's a huge number of people who are displaced, and even those that are within the camps are living in terrible, terrible conditions.
So although this was a study into the impact on livelihoods by this war, the human cost remains greater. But as someone who has been studying the insurgent group Boko Haram, let me ask you, do you think we have underestimated this war in its entirety, or are we, playing denial here?
I think it's a combination of both. I think we did underestimate it, and I think we still continue to underestimate it. One of the things I always say is that we need to keep connecting the dots. We have, it's been widely acknowledged now that the head of Jazz, which is Shekau, has actually been killed. But are we thinking about what's happening with regards to his replacement? Why is that important to us? If you look at ISWAP, Islamic State West Africa Province, for example, they are much more organized. They have a huge army. They're taking over territory. Now, can you imagine if they combine their territory with that of Shekau's? That's the first problem. The second problem is that in the last few years, we've had trials of Boko Haram insurgents, especially those that are supposed to be financing the insurgency, because we feel that if we can cut off the financing, we can reduce a lot of the problems. So there have been trials. Now that you have a situation where it is Islamic State West Africa Province that is actually in charge, Their funding comes internationally. So what are we doing about that? Well, how are we thinking about that? So yes, we have underestimated, and we still, I do believe, are not acknowledging the extent of the problem. As I speak now, we have 4 major factions of Boko Haram. So the one we're familiar with is Shekau's. We're familiar with ISWAP, which is headed by Al-Banawi. We've got Ansarul Muslimin, which is also gaining traction now, which is headed by Abu Usama al-Ansari. And then we have Harakatul Muhajirin, which is also headed by Khalid al-Banawi. So I think we need to understand that we're dealing with a hydra-headed monster, and that's not going to go away very quickly.
Okay, I'm curious now. I was going to ask you another question, but now you mentioned these various factions. My attention is drawn to the fact that could you help us identify what would be their end game? These various factions are foreign factions, just essentially using Nigeria as their site for their own warfare. What could be their end game?
So their end game, actually, at the end of the day, is actually to gain territory and to actually create what you would call their own, quote and unquote, country. And they're already doing that. ISWAP is already doing that. There are huge tracts of the areas that are covered by ISWAP that we don't have access to. And you also have to remember that they're operating in the Lake Chad Basin, operating across 4 countries. There's Nigeria, there's Niger, there's Cameroon, and there's Chad. And you know what has happened recently with the leadership in Chad, which is giving us a lot of concern here in Nigeria. But at the end of the day, that is what they're saying. They want their own caliphate. But the problem you have is that if you have so many different factions wanting their own caliphate, you start to wonder, who exactly is it are we fighting? And in truth, where do we begin? Or where does one territory begin and the next territory end? So these are some of the issues that we really have to contend with. But at the end of the day, that's what they want. They want their own caliphate, they want independence, and they probably want to be able to be affiliated with some of the national groups, ISIS.
And you talked about the foreign intervention here. The world is such a global village that whatever affects Africa affects everyone. And so I guess that's why this summit is coming into place today. Foreign ministers from more than 40 countries, including the US and UK, are converging on Rome today to discuss the growing presence of IS on the continent of Africa. How effective do you think this summit would be, and what should they be discussing?
Okay, so one of the greatest challenges always with a counterinsurgency strategy is actually agreeing what exactly is insurgency, or let me put it differently, a counterterrorism strategy is agreeing what terrorism is. And that is actually, it may seem like such a simple challenge, but it's actually one of the biggest challenges that the world is facing. It's actually for the world leaders to agree on what terrorism is. And let me put it sort of clearly to you. So, there's that, they say that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. So you have a situation where when you look at, so the world is a global village in a larger sense, but when it comes to agreeing on which groups are supposed to be branded as freedom fighters, which groups are supposed to be branded as terrorists, you then start to see a divergence. And there's always been skepticism from the point of view of not just the Africans, but I would probably say from the Arab nations, as to how the world sees terrorism. So I think one of the first things they need to do is to actually agree on a united counterterrorism framework. And then also agree that you get to a certain threshold where, irrespective of what benefits you are gaining as a nation from a particular group, that once that group has been designated as a terror group, then you are going to fight that group in pretty much the same way. What we're seeing is that people are picking, or countries are choosing and picking according to how how these different factions benefit their own personal agenda. It's very unfortunate. And, you know, part of it also has to do with resources, where countries feel that they are either mining resources or exploring resources. There's a risk to their own economic gain or the financial relationship that they have with a particular country or particular group that actually impacts how they define or fight counterterrorism.
Okay, Aisha, let's bring it back to home, the home front. What developments have you seen in your own involvement and in the NGO space over the years? And what do you expect to see with the unveiling of this kind of information? I know you say we've had it over time, but now it's been brought to light. What do you expect to see in terms of war against insecurity and the humanitarian crisis, intervention?
So I think bringing it back home, the first thing we need to do, we need to go back to the root cause. We need to root out this insurgency. We need to equip the military. We have to find a way in which we stem and we plug all avenues through which they are fundraising or they are funding these activities, whether it's in terms of kidnappings, in terms of drugs, organized crime. We need to look closely at their affiliations with other international groups. When people started talking about ISWAP years ago, I think we should have paid a lot more attention. These people are taking over territory, they're building strong armies. But the other thing is that we need to go back to thinking, how do we win back the hearts and minds of our people? There's too many ungoverned spaces. And when I say ungoverned, how do you have a situation where there are people who actually cannot feel the presence of government in their lives? And then you have a situation where terrorists are able to provide them with alternatives, with opportunities, whether it's in terms of farming, in terms of fishing. I mean, look at what has happened to the Lake Chad. The Lake Chad has pretty much dried up. And if you think about the almost 30 million people whose livelihoods are dependent on that lake, what are we doing about that? So these are some of the things that we need to be able to think about. I've mentioned the fact that, have you had any thinking regarding who is going to replace Shekau in terms of the leadership of Jazz, and in terms of also their affiliation with ISWAP, what's going to happen? And then the last one is that we keep doing it. We're seeing it now happening in the Northwest, in the North Central. What we allow is we see a situation where crime begins to merge with political violence, begins to merge with religious fundamentalism, and begins to merge. And then we develop another uncontrollable insurgency. So my view is that we need to go back to the drawing board.
Indeed. Always nice talking to you, Aisha OYEBODE. Thank you so much for being on Newsday.